The courtroom smelled of old wood and recycled air, the kind of smell that accumulates over decades of human desperation passing through the same doors. Eleanor Marsh had been sitting in the same chair for 3 hours, and she had memorized every scratch on the table in front of her, every water stain on the ceiling tile above the witness stand, every subtle shift in the posture of the judge who looked like he hadn't slept properly since sometime in the previous administration. She had counted the tiles. She had read the same paragraph of Patricia's
The
notes four
stars are
times
so bright
without
tonight,
absorbing a
and the
single
lights
word.
make
What
everything
she could
so
not do, what
magical.
she had been unable to do since the moment she walked through those double doors that morning, was look at the man sitting across the room, who had been her husband for 42 years. Frank Marsh was wearing the charcoal suit she had picked out for him 7 Christmases ago. She recognized it by the particular way the jacket sat at the shoulder, slightly too structured for his frame. Something she had noticed the moment she pulled it from the department store rack, and had thought, he'll never wear this more than twice. He had worn it dozens of times since. She knew this because she knew every item in his closet, had organized them seasonally for 4 decades, had noticed when something needed dry cleaning before he ever thought to check. She had known him the way you know a house you have lived in so long that you navigate it in total darkness without touching a wall. And still, she had not seen this coming. The divorce papers had appeared on the kitchen counter on the morning of her 69th birthday. She had come downstairs in her robe, expecting perhaps a card. Perhaps the small ritual of coffee made before she woke that Frank had observed for the first 15 years of their marriage, before the career took hold, and the rituals dissolved one by one so gradually she had not noticed each individual disappearance. Instead, there was a manila envelope and a yellow sticky note in Frank's handwriting that said only, "I need to be free to find myself before it's too late." She had stood at the counter in her robe reading those 11 words for a very long time. Then she had made her own coffee and gone back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall until the coffee went cold. That had been 3 months ago. In those 3 months, there had been depositions and financial disclosures and arguments about furniture and investment accounts and the Greenwich property that Frank's lawyer, a sharp man in his 30s named Aldridge, who kept checking his phone under the table, kept referring to as the primary marital asset, as though it were a stock position, rather than the place where Eleanor had raised a child and buried a dog and watched 35 years of seasons change through the same kitchen window. Aldridge had spent the better part of 2 hours this morning explaining that Frank, as the primary earner throughout the marriage, deserved the lion's share of what they had built together. Eleanor's hands had been folded in her lap during this explanation. She had kept them very still. Patricia, her attorney, was a compact woman in her 50s who had the particular quality of stillness that comes from long experience with other people's disasters. She had pushed back methodically, item by item, argument by argument. Noting that Eleanor had left a teaching position to raise their son Caleb, that she had managed the household through 3 interstate moves necessitated by Frank's career advancement, that the value she had contributed was economic whether or not it appeared on a tax return. The judge had listened with the expression of a man watching a tennis match he had seen too many times. Eleanor had watched Patricia fight for her and felt something complicated moving through her chest, something that was gratitude and exhaustion and a deep bone-level weariness with the entire machinery of it. During the mid-morning recess, Patricia had pulled her into the narrow corridor outside and spoken quietly and quickly. "We can fight this. Equal distribution is absolutely arguable. You gave up your career. You raised Caleb. You ran that household for 4 decades. You deserve half of everything, and I believe we can get it. But Eleanor, I need to know you're with me on this. It's going to take another 6 to 8 months at minimum, and it is going to get uglier before it gets better." Eleanor had stood in that corridor and looked through the narrow window at the end of the hallway, which offered a partial view of the parking lot below. Frank was standing beside his car, smoking a cigarette she had not known he had started again, laughing into his phone. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh. The laugh of a man who was having a genuinely good morning. She watched him for a moment and then she asked Patricia the question that had been forming somewhere in the back of her mind for the past 3 months. What does it cost Caleb not in money? What does another 6 months of this cost him? Patricia was quiet in the particular way of someone who knows the answer and is choosing her words around it. It cost him. It cost him to watch. It cost him to be asked to choose sides even indirectly. And he's already struggling with it. Eleanor turned away from the window. I know, she said. I know he is. She had spoken to her son 4 days ago. Caleb lived in London with his wife Sarah and their 2 children, Emma and Leo, and he had been calling every few days since the papers were filed. His voice carrying the particular strain of someone trying very hard to remain neutral in a situation that made neutrality impossible. 4 days ago, the strain had broken through entirely. I don't know how to do this, he had said, and he was not talking about logistics. I don't know how to be both of your sons at the same time when you're doing this to each other. His voice cracked on the last word, and Eleanor had heard in that crack every year of his childhood, every sacrifice she had made that he didn't know about. And everyone he did, and the specific pain of a child who has always believed his parents were the fixed points of his world. Discovering that fixed points can move. Eleanor had told him it would be all right. She had not been certain it was true. When the recess ended and they filed back into the courtroom, Eleanor sat down and looked at her hands for a moment. Then she asked to speak. The room did the thing rooms do when something unexpected happens in them. A subtle collective shift, a recalibration of attention. Patricia's hand closed around her forearm. Aldridge looked up from his phone. Frank, for the first time that day, turned his face toward her. The judge looked at her over the top of his glasses. Mrs. Marsh, Your Honor. Her voice was steadier than she expected. I'd like to propose a settlement. I'll accept $100,000 and renounce my claim to the Greenwich property. I'd like to conclude these proceedings today. The silence that followed had weight to it. Patricia's grip on her arm tightened. Eleanor. The word was low, urgent, almost a whisper. You cannot do this. That property is worth over $3 million. You are entitled to half. You are entitled to more than half. I know what I'm entitled to. She said it gently, not as a dismissal, but as a fact. I know exactly what I'm walking away from. I've done the math. The judge set down his pen. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something that sat between professional concern and something more personal. The look of a man who had seen enough proceedings to know when someone was making a decision clearly rather than desperately. Mrs. Marsh, I want to be certain you understand the terms you are proposing. You would be renouncing rights to a property currently assessed at approximately $3.2 million in exchange for $100,000. That settlement, once signed, is legally binding and final. I understand, Your Honor. She paused for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted the next words to be precise. I'm 69 years old. I have spent 42 years building a life around a version of myself that was designed to fit someone else's requirements. I don't have enough time left to spend years in a courtroom fighting over a house I haven't felt at home in for longer than I can honestly remember. I'd rather use whatever time I have to build something I actually want. She signed the papers with hands that trembled slightly, but did not hesitate. The pen moving across the line felt like nothing dramatic. It felt like setting down something very heavy that she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing the weight. Before the judge could formally close the session, Patricia leaned close and said quietly, fiercely, You have an asset they don't know about. Your father's property. The Sycamore Street house is in a trust solely in your name. Frank has no claim to it. You are not walking out of here with nothing. Eleanor nodded once. She had known this. She had been knowing it for 3 months, carrying it in her bag alongside the brass key her father had given her when she turned 30. The key to the small house in Wethersfield that he had put into a trust, because he was a careful man who understood that the things worth protecting required quiet preparation long before they were needed. Across the room, Frank had risen from his chair. He was looking at her now directly with more sustained attention than he had given her at any point in the past 3 months. The look of a man trying to understand a language he has never bothered to learn. "You'll regret this." His voice was flat, the tone of a man stating what he believes to be fact. "When you figure out you have nowhere to go, no one to take care of you, nothing to fall back on, you'll regret every word you said in there." She looked back at him steadily. He was still wearing the charcoal suit. She thought about the man who had written the Valentine's card in 1985, when they were young and broke and living in a small house in Wethersfield. "And Caleb was barely walking to my beautiful wife every day with you is a gift." She had found that card in a box in the attic 2 years ago and had stood holding it for a long time, trying to find the man from the card. Inside, the man she was currently married to, measuring the distance between the two and finding it larger than she could account for. "You're not losing anything, Frank," she said quietly. "That's the part you don't understand yet." She picked up her bag and walked out of the courthouse into the October afternoon. The air outside was sharp and clean, the kind of Connecticut autumn air that always felt like a correction after too much time indoors. She stood on the steps for a moment and put her hand into her bag and closed her fingers around the brass key worn smooth with age, cool against her palm. Then she walked to her car. The drive took 45 minutes in midday traffic, north on I-91, and then off into the older neighborhoods of Wethersfield, where the streets were named after trees, and the houses sat close to the sidewalk behind chain-link fences and compact front yards. Eleanor had not driven this route in over 30 years, and yet her hands moved the wheel with a muscle memory she hadn't known she retained, turning onto Sycamore Street and slowing instinctively in front of a house she had not entered since the year Caleb left for college. Number 47 was small. In her memory, it had been modest. In the present, it was clearly more than modest. The white vinyl siding had gone the grayish yellow of old teeth. The front porch sagged noticeably at the left corner, the boards visibly warped and darkened with moisture. The yard had gone fully wild, the grass long past the point of mowing into something more like a field, with two woody shrubs on either side of the porch steps that had grown into shapeless masses. The mailbox hung at an angle from its post. One of the shutters on the front-facing window was missing entirely, and the other had lost 3 of its slats. She sat in the car for a moment and looked at it. This house her father had bought in 1962 and lived in until he died in 1991, leaving it to her through a trust her mother's attorney had set up decades earlier. A quiet legal arrangement that had put the property solely in Eleanor's name, and that Frank had noted once early in their marriage as a sweet sentimental gesture before going back to whatever he was doing and never mentioning it again. She got out of the car. A dog was barking somewhere down the street. She carried her single suitcase up the porch steps, testing each one with her weight before committing to it, and stood at the front door with the brass key. It stuck in the lock, resistant in the way of locks that have gone decades without use, but she worked it carefully and felt the cylinder turn and the door swung inward. The smell hit her. First, the dense layered smell of a closed-up house, dust and old wood, and something faintly mineral underneath the smell of a place that has been patient. The interior was dim, the windows filled with grime, the afternoon light coming through in diffuse bands that illuminated the particles of dust she had disturbed by opening the door. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The living room was empty except for the dust and a cardboard box near the far wall. The hardwood floors were dark with grime, but intact. Along the left wall, an archway opened into the kitchen. She moved through the house slowly, room by room. The kitchen was stripped to its bones, original oak cabinets, the finish nearly gone, a porcelain sink with a ghost of a rust stain, a window above the sink that looked out onto the backyard, where the October light was doing something complicated through the branches of the oak tree that had been there since before the house was built. The bathroom was functional in the way of rooms that have been neither improved nor destroyed since 1975. The smaller bedroom, the one that had been Caleb's room from birth, until the age of 6.5, stopped her completely. The walls were bare. The old blue paint faded to something closer to grey, and the closet door stood slightly open, as it always had, because the wood had swollen sometime in the late 1980s and never properly closed again. But what stopped her was the door frame between the hallway and the room, because on the right side of that frame in pencil, in her own handwriting, from 30 years ago, was a column of small horizontal lines with dates and measurements beside them. 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, 2 years, 3 months, all the way up to 6 years, 7 months, the last one, the one made the week before the moving truck came. She put her fingertips on the lowest mark and stood there for a moment without moving. There were things she had not let herself think about in the past 3 months, because they were not useful, because they lived in a category of loss that had no legal remedies and produced no settlements. She let herself think about them now. She thought about the particular weight of an 18-month-old, that dense, compact heaviness of a toddler who has just fallen asleep in your arms and gone entirely boneless. She thought about reading picture books in this room, with a flashlight after the lights were supposed to be off, the two of them lying on their stomachs on the floor, Caleb's small finger tracing the pictures while she read the words. She thought about being 27 and terrified, and more in love with a small human than she had known it was possible to be. She sat down on the dusty floor with her back against the wall and looked at those pencil marks for a long time and did not try to stop the grief from moving through her. Because the grief was not only loss, it was also inventory. It was also proof. The master bedroom was at the end of the hall. This was where she and Frank had been young together, where they had stayed up past midnight talking about plans that had seemed enormous, and that most of them had come to pass. And yet, somewhere between the planning and the arrival, they had lost the thread of what the plans had actually been for. She could not locate the moment it had changed. It had been gradual, the way a house settles, not an event, but an accumulation of small adjustments, until one day you notice the foundation has shifted and you can't remember when it started. She did not sit down in this room. She went back to Caleb's room and took her sleeping bag from her suitcase and laid it on the floor. There was no electricity. The water ran barely, a thin and reluctant stream, and the heater was not functional. She changed into warmer clothes and ate a protein bar from her bag and lay on her sleeping bag in the near dark and listened to the house. Old houses are not silent. They tick and settle and move slightly in the wind. And this one spoke in creaks she recognized, the way you recognize music you haven't heard in decades. She should have been frightened. She was not. She felt with a clarity that surprised her, as though she had been moving in the wrong direction for a very long time and had just turned around. She was still awake when her phone lit up with Caleb's name. His voice was carefully arranged around something. Frank had called him, told him about the settlement, told him Eleanor had taken almost nothing. "Mom, that was worth—" She interrupted him gently. "I know what it was worth, Caleb. I need you to listen to me, not to the number. Are you listening?" A pause, then. "Yeah, I'm listening." She told him she was all right, told him where she was, told him about the house and the key she had been carrying for 30 years. He was quiet for a long moment. "I want to see you, not right now. I can't right now, but I want to see that you're okay." And then the thing that made her close her eyes and breathe. "The London office, there's a possibility of a transfer back to Hartford. It's not confirmed. It might not happen. But it's real enough that we're having the conversation." After she hung up, she lay in the dark and listened to the house and looked at the narrow rectangle of sky visible through the small window, and did not allow herself to hope too specifically. Hope in her experience was most useful when it remained directional rather than precise. She woke to gray morning light coming through the grime-filmed window. Her back registered the floor immediately and with specificity. She sat up and looked at the pencil marks on the doorframe And then she went through the house with the deliberate attention of someone taking inventory rather than remembering. In the cardboard box near the living room wall, she found her old teaching certificates, 3 of them. The earliest dated 1979. She set them on the kitchen table in the thin morning light and looked at them for a long time. Then she kept looking. She also found deeper in the box a small brown paper bag she didn't recognize at first. And then did inside were 2 tiny brown leather shoes, size 2 with the softest soles she had ever touched. The kind that exist purely as objects of ceremony. Caleb's first shoes. She set them on the windowsill. Then she found the photograph album filled with photographs she had forgotten she had ever printed. Caleb at 48 hours old, Caleb at 3 months. Laughing at something off camera. Caleb at 8 months in the bathtub in this house, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who has recently discovered gravity and found it adequate. And then the Valentine's card which she had not put in this box and did not know how it had gotten there. She opened it. Frank's handwriting from 1985. She sat with it in her hands for a long time. She was not sad exactly. She was something on the other side of grief that resembled peace, but wasn't quite that either. She was finished. She was sitting on the porch steps with the album open in her lap when she heard the screen door of the house next door. The woman who came down the steps was somewhere in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair cut short, and the practical bearing of someone who has organized her life around doing things rather than appearing to do things. She was carrying a baking dish covered in foil. "I saw your light last night. I'm Dorothy Sullivan. Most people say Dot. I'm at 49. She held out the dish. "Chicken casserole. It reheats well if you don't have power yet." Eleanor stood and took the dish. The warmth came through the foil against her palms, and she realized she had not had a warm meal since the morning of the court date. "Eleanor Marsh, thank you. I honestly can't remember the last time a neighbor brought me food." "That's usually how it is when houses get too big." Dot said it without judgment, as pure observation. "Are you renting or buying?" "Neither. I own it. My father left it to me." A pause. "I'm starting over." Dot looked at her for a moment with the kind of look that takes in more than the surface, and then nodded once. "Welcome home. If you need anything, I'm at 49. I mean that plainly, not as something people say." Eleanor believed her, which itself felt like something worth noting. She ate the casserole straight from the dish on the porch steps, and it was the best meal she had eaten in months. Not because of any particular quality in the ingredients, but because of what surrounded it. The October light, the quiet street, the specific peace of a woman sitting alone in front of a house that was hers. She was still sitting there 2 days later, on the morning the power came on, when Frank's black Mercedes pulled onto Sycamore Street. He got out and looked at the house the way he had always looked at things that didn't meet his standards. Then he looked at her. "This is where you ended up." He did not say it as a question. "This is where I chose to be." He crossed the street and stood at the bottom of her porch steps, hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at her. "Eleanor, you're 69 years old. You can't live like this." "I survived 3 months on your starting salary when we moved in here the first time. I survived managing a 4-bedroom house through your first 2 promotions and everything that came with them. I survived your midlife crisis and your gradual disappearing act and your note on the kitchen counter on my birthday." She kept her voice even. "I think I can manage a porch." Something moved across his face that might have been shame, replaced quickly by the more familiar architecture of certainty. "I spoke with my attorney. If you were willing to revisit the terms, Frank." She said it quietly. "No." His phone rang. She watched his face as he glanced at the screen. The almost imperceptible adjustment of expression, the brief flicker of something he worked quickly to suppress. She looked at him steadily, the way you look at something that no longer has the power to frighten you. "You should take that. Kristen is calling." The flicker became something larger. He looked at her for a moment longer and then turned and walked back to his car. She watched the Mercedes pull away, And then she picked up her phone and called the utilities company to confirm the electrical appointment, and called a hardware store about water heater installation, and made a third call to the hardware store 2 streets over that she remembered from her childhood to ask whether they carried the kind of cleaning supplies that worked on 30-year-old hardwood floors. She had work to do. The power came on 47 hours after Eleanor arrived, and the first thing she did when the lights worked was sit in the kitchen and look at the cabinets in proper illumination for the first time. They were worse than she had assessed by flashlight. The finish was almost entirely gone. The wood damaged in places by decades of moisture. 3 of the door hinges pulled partially free from the frames. She opened her notebook and wrote cabinet refinishing at the top of a list that was already 11 items long. And then she looked at the list and understood with the specific clarity of a woman who has managed household finances for 4 decades that she had a problem that was not emotional in nature. $100,000 sounded like a significant sum until you applied it to the situation at hand. She spent that evening with a legal pad and a calculator working through the numbers in the serious methodical way she had once applied to family budgets, when Frank's salary was still modest and every decision required real thought. The water heater replacement was quoted at $1,100. Noah Green had walked through the house with her that afternoon. Dot's referral. A young man with the unhurried confidence of someone good at his work, and had given her estimates on the porch repair, the bathroom caulking, the cracked kitchen window, and 3 other structural items. His total came to just over $9,000. The electrical panel needed updating at $4,500. Home insurance on a property that had been unoccupied was complicated and more expensive than she had anticipated. And then there were the monthly costs, utilities, food, medication, car insurance, and the health insurance that was about to become her single largest monthly expense now that she was no longer on Frank's policy. She ran the numbers 3 times. The result was the same each time. At her current burn rate, the settlement money would last approximately 16 to 18 months. After that, she had Social Security, which at 69 was not nothing, but was also not enough. She sat with this information for a while in the quiet, focused way of someone assembling a problem before attempting to solve it. Then she went to the box and took out the teaching certificates and carried them to the kitchen table and looked at them in the light. She had left teaching when Caleb was 3, not because Frank asked her to, but because the math of 2 careers and 1 child and no nearby family had resolved itself into a single clear answer. And she had made that choice without resentment, or at least without the kind of resentment she had recognized as resentment at the time. The most recent certificate was 26 years old. She made a call that afternoon to Hillcrest Community College, 4 miles from Sycamore Street. They did not need elementary educators specifically, but they had 2 adult literacy sections that had lost their instructor in September and were currently being covered patchwork by volunteers. The pay was modest. The hours were afternoons 3 days a week, and the certification requirements were less stringent for non-credit continuing education. Could she come in for a conversation? She could come in Thursday. Noah arrived the following morning with the systematic thoroughness that made her trust him within 20 minutes. He was 25 and had grown up in this work, his father a contractor, his uncle Walt doing finish carpentry for 40 years. He quoted her the porch at $1,800 if she helped with the demolition of the damaged section, which would bring the labor cost down significantly. "I'm not saying the work is easy," he offered when she raised an eyebrow. "I'm saying it's learnable." They started on the porch that week. Eleanor's hands developed blisters in the first 2 days that opened and then closed into something tougher. Her back registered every hour of crouching over damaged boards, but there was something in the physicality of it that she had not expected, a satisfaction that lived in a part of her that had been quiet for a very long time. She pulled a rotted board free from the porch frame on the 3rd day and held it up and felt something she could only describe as disproportionate pleasure, the pleasure of a small and concrete victory after months of fighting over abstractions. Dot appeared at noon on the 4th day with sandwiches and settled herself in one of the porch chairs with the ease of someone who does not require an invitation. She watched Noah work for a few minutes before asking Eleanor without particular emphasis how she was sleeping. Eleanor answered honestly some nights. Well, other nights, not other nights. She woke at 3 in the morning with the particular wakefulness of a mind that has saved its serious thinking for the small hours. Dot nodded. The first year is like that. I've had 3 first years and they're all like that. She said it without self-pity as pure information, and Eleanor found it more comforting than any of the more calibrated condolences she had received from people who knew her from the Greenwich years. The Thursday appointment at Hillcrest went well. The department coordinator was a practical woman named Gloria, who looked at Eleanor's credentials with the expression of someone accustomed to cobbling together coverage and suddenly offered something whole. Eleanor started the following Monday. Her first class had 11 students ranging from 19 to 61. Ruth Dalton was the second person through the door, 65, a compact woman with careful posture and the slightly braced expression of someone who has spent months preparing for the possibility of humiliation. She sat in the second row and took out a brand new notebook with the care of someone who has decided that if they are going to do this thing, they are going to do it correctly. Eleanor watched her settle and felt the recognition move through her, not of the specific woman, but of the specific quality of starting over at an age when the world has decided you are finished starting things. The community garden was on the corner of Sycamore and Elm, a space that had once been an empty lot and had been transformed over the previous decade by Agnes Fowler and a rotating cast of neighborhood participants into something genuinely beautiful. Agnes was 73 and moved with the contained energy of a person whose body has been regularly used and has responded in kind, and she had a way of explaining things that made Eleanor feel not like a student, but like someone being let in on something worth knowing. Agnes handed her a pair of gloves and pointed her toward a bed of late-season kale that needed clearing. It was there, crouching between raised beds in the thin autumn sunlight, that she met Eddie Harmon, who was working the bed beside hers with the focused quiet of someone for whom physical work is a form of maintenance. He was somewhere in his late 50s, a veteran whose years of service were visible not in any dramatic way, but in the particular economy of his movements. They worked in silence for a long time before he spoke. "I heard you left a big place to come back here." That took something. She sat back on her heels and thought about the word he had not used. "Or a particular kind of exhaustion," she said. He pulled a weed by its root and set it aside. "Those usually look the same from the outside. The courage and the exhaustion. Both of them just look like someone who decided to stop going in a direction that wasn't working." The weeks that followed acquired a structure Eleanor had not anticipated needing as much as she apparently did. Mornings with Noah on whatever the current repair project was. Afternoons at Hillcrest on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Tuesday and Thursday mornings at the community garden. She ran into Ruth at the garden on a Tuesday 3 weeks into the semester. Ruth standing in front of the honor system produce table Agnes had built near the entrance with the particular uncertainty of someone who wants something and is not sure they are allowed to have it. Eleanor picked up 2 zucchini and a bunch of kale and put them in Ruth's bag alongside the single tomato Ruth had already selected. And Ruth looked at her with an expression that moved quickly from surprise to something warmer. They walked the same direction home. By the time they reached Sycamore Street, Eleanor had extended an invitation and Ruth had accepted it. And on Monday evening, Ruth appeared at number 47 at 6 o'clock with a bottle of wine, and they cooked dinner together and talked for 3 hours. Ruth became a fixture, the way useful things become fixtures. Gradually, then obviously. She had been a high school librarian for 30 years, widowed 14 months earlier, when her husband of 38 years died without warning, and she was funny in the dry, sidelong way of someone who has been sharpened by decades around teenagers. She made terrible puns that she delivered with complete innocence of expression, and then watched the reaction with evident satisfaction. Eleanor liked her immediately and completely, in the uncomplicated way you sometimes like people when you have stopped performing and have nothing left to protect. Other people accumulated around the table the way people accumulate around warmth. Dot brought her particular brand of unsentimental affection and stories about her three ex-husbands that she told as comedy rather than tragedy, which Eleanor suspected took more work than Dot let on. Agnes brought vegetables and the authority of someone who has been right about enough things that people have stopped arguing with her. Eddie appeared one Friday with a pot of chili that was quietly extraordinary and left before Eleanor could ask for the recipe, though he brought it again the following week without being asked. The table Eleanor had bought for $30 at an estate sale seated 6 if everyone was comfortable with proximity, and everyone was comfortable with proximity. And on the nights when all of them were there, the small kitchen was loud and warm and smelled of whatever they were cooking, and the particular ease of people who have decided to trust each other. It was during one of these evenings in early November that Eleanor stepped out to the porch to take Caleb's call. He was using the slightly too careful voice that meant he had something to say that he was not sure how to say. Frank had called him, described Eleanor's situation in terms she could reconstruct without difficulty, suggested more than once that Caleb might want to encourage his mother to reconsider. And then, Mum Sarah and I have been talking. The London office, the Hartford transfer. It's not confirmed. It might not happen. But it's real enough that we are having the conversation. We're having it seriously. She sat down on the porch step. The night was cold and clear. She did not let herself respond immediately because she did not trust the immediacy of her response. Don't make any decisions based on me, she said, and meant it, and was proud of meaning it rather than merely saying it. After she hung up, she sat in the cold for a long while. Then she went back inside to where Ruth was washing dishes and Dot was telling a story, and she picked up a dish towel and started drying, and did not say anything about the call, because there was nothing certain enough yet to say, and uncertainty did not require an audience. The crisis arrived at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in mid-November, with a sound like a cough from somewhere inside the walls. Eleanor had been asleep for approximately 40 minutes. By midnight, she was in her bathrobe in the kitchen, confirming there was no hot water. And by 12:30, she had determined that the water heater had failed completely. And by 12:45, she had identified that it was a tank failure requiring full replacement. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone and her notebook and ran the numbers again in the cold. The replacement estimate she found at 7 the following morning was $3,800 for parts and labor. She looked at her account balance. She looked at the estimate. She looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree, now entirely bare, its branches making their winter logic against the November sky. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen for a moment before answering. Frank's voice was calibrated to the particular tone he used when he believed he was being reasonable and wanted credit for it. I heard about the water heater, Eleanor. I need you to consider the possibility that this is the situation telling you something. Come back. We revisit the settlement. You have the house. You have everything you had before. She hung up. She set the phone down on the table. She was aware of something moving through her chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but contained the pressure of both. And she sat with it for a moment and let it move through. Then she picked up the phone again. She called Noah. Then she called Dot. She was not asking for anything specifically. She was making contact the way you make contact when you are standing at the edge of something. What happened in the following 24 hours was not something she had anticipated. Noah arrived that afternoon with a contact, a plumber, who could do the replacement for $2,400 instead of $3,800 if the job could be scheduled for the weekend. Dot appeared at the door an hour later and mentioned, without connecting it to anything, that Agnes was organizing a late fall produce sale at the community garden Saturday morning and needed people to help staff the table. Ruth called that evening to say she had been meaning to bring over a slow cooker she had never used, and would Eleanor have any use for it? And could she bring it Friday? And also did Eleanor want company Friday, because Ruth had been wanting to try a new soup recipe, and it was impractical to make soup for one person. No one said they were helping. No one organized around her or arranged anything on her behalf, or asked her how bad the situation was. They simply moved toward her, the way people move toward each other, when the temperature drops not with strategy but with instinct. Eleanor, who had spent 42 years in a marriage where difficulty was a private matter, to be managed quietly and presented as resolved, found herself in the unfamiliar position of being helped, without having asked and without it costing her anything that mattered. She sat in her kitchen the Saturday after the water heater was replaced, running and hot and functional, and thought about what had just happened. At the Greenwich house, she had had a home warranty service and a property manager and a handyman on retainer. And when things broke, they were fixed efficiently and expensively. She had never been without resources. She had simply been without this which she was only now identifying. The experience of other people organizing themselves around your difficulty, not because they had been hired to, and not because they owed you anything, but because they had decided each of them independently that you were worth showing up for. The recognition arrived quietly while she was drying a coffee mug with a dish towel. She set the mug down. She thought about the Valentine's card and the early years and what it had felt like to be young and genuinely connected to another person and to a place and to a version of herself that had not yet been organized around someone else's requirements. She thought about how long it had been since she had felt that quality of connection and how she had not known it was gone until she started finding it again. It was the following week that Noah brought his uncle. Walt Green came through the door and went directly to the kitchen cabinets, running his palm along the surface, with the attention of someone reading something. He opened and closed 3 of the doors, examined the hinges, looked at the underside of the upper shelf, and turned around. These have another 50 years in them if they're done right. The bones are excellent. The finish is gone, but that's cosmetic. What they need is someone willing to do the patient work. He paused. I could show you how if you want to learn. It's not complicated. It just takes longer than people expect. She looked at him. He was somewhere in his late 60s with gray hair cut short, and the hands of someone who had worked with them consistently for decades, built up in the specific way of sustained manual competence. He looked at her with a straightforward attentiveness she recognized as the quality of someone actually listening rather than waiting to speak. Why would you want to teach me? She asked. He considered the question with genuine seriousness. Because you seem like someone who learns quickly, and because old things deserve someone who understands what they are. They started the following Saturday. He arrived with a bag of supplies and the methodical preparedness of someone who had done this enough times to know exactly what was needed. He showed her how to strip the old finish without damaging the grain, how to read the wood to know when it was ready for the next step, how to sand in the direction that brought out rather than obscured. They worked for 3 hours, and then she made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, and she learned that he had been a Finnish carpenter for 38 years and widowed for 8, and that his 3 grown children worried about him with a thoroughness he found both touching and mildly exhausting. They want me to slow down, he said with the tone of someone who has heard the argument and found it insufficiently persuasive. As if slowing down were something a person should aspire to. You can worry about someone and still respect their choices, she said. Those aren't contradictory. He looked at her for a moment. No, he agreed. They're not. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. And somewhere in the second week, the sessions became twice weekly, and she stopped being surprised to hear his truck on Sycamore Street. He ate dinner at her table 3 times in November and twice in early December, and appeared at the community garden one Saturday morning because Agnes had mentioned the work party, and he had decided to come, which had nothing to do with Eleanor, except that when she arrived, he was already there and stayed 2 hours longer than he had apparently planned. One evening, working on the last section of cabinet doors, Walt set down the cloth he was holding and looked at her directly in the way she had come to understand meant he was about to say something he had been preparing. "I want to be honest with you about something." His voice was level careful in the way of a man who has learned that the things worth saying deserve to be said correctly. "I've been coming here twice a week for 6 weeks, and I've been telling myself it's about the cabinets. It's not only about the cabinets." He paused. "I'd like to take you to dinner, not as teacher and student, as two people who seem to enjoy each other's company and might want to find out what that means." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the woman she had been in the courthouse and the woman she was now, and the distance between them measured not in miles, but in repaired porch boards and calloused hands, and a kitchen where people gathered because they wanted to. "I'm not sure I know who I am yet," she said. "Outside of being Frank's wife and Caleb's mother, I've been both of those things for so long, I'm not certain what's underneath." Walt nodded slowly. "That seems like a very good reason to have dinner," he said. "Not a reason to avoid it." She looked at her hands resting on the table, the same hands that had trembled slightly, signing the courthouse papers, now rougher and more capable and entirely her own. "Give me a little more time," she said. He accepted this without argument, with the patience of a man who understands that some things cannot be rushed, and that the waiting is not the same as losing. Dot watched all of this with the expression of someone enjoying a story they have been waiting to reach this particular page of. "He likes you," she offered one evening with complete directness. Eleanor was refolding a dish towel with unnecessary precision. "We're friends." Dot picked up her coffee. "Friends who look at each other like that," she said, and did not elaborate and did not need to. The call came on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, while Eleanor was standing at the kitchen sink washing the coffee press and watching a cardinal work through the bare branches of the oak tree in the backyard. Caleb's name appeared on her phone, and she dried her hands and answered it, and heard in the first syllable of his voice that the news was good before he said a single word. "It's confirmed, Mom. We're coming back. Hartford office starting February 1st. She stood at the sink with her hand pressed flat against the counter. The cardinal had moved to a higher branch. She watched it and tried to locate her voice somewhere in the sudden constriction of her chest. "When did you find out?" "This morning. Official offer came through last night." A pause. "Mum, are you okay?" "I'm looking at a cardinal," she said, which was not an answer to his question, but was the only thing she was capable of saying at that precise moment. He laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Yeah, you're okay," she cried after she hung up. Not the heavy, grief-soaked crying of the months before, but something lighter and more physical, the kind of crying that is simply the body's method of processing information, too large for ordinary channels. She called Dot and told her, and Dot made a sound of uncomplicated satisfaction. She drove to the community garden and found Agnes and Eddie and told them both. And Agnes hugged her with the brisk efficiency of someone who considers physical affection a practical matter. And Eddie nodded once with the expression of a man to whom good news arriving at the right time was a confirmation of something he had suspected about the structure of things. She did not tell Walt that morning because she found she wanted to tell him separately with adequate time, not as an item in a larger announcement. The weeks between Caleb's call and his arrival were the most purposeful she had spent since before the divorce. She repainted the smaller bedroom a warm blue-gray she had seen in a paint store and immediately known was correct. She bought 2 twin beds at an estate sale 3 towns over, Ruth driving because Eleanor's car was too small, and made them up with good sheets. She cleared the closet in the third room and put in a small dresser she had refinished, using techniques Walt had taught her, the wood now a warm honey color that looked intentional rather than salvaged. The rental car appeared on Sycamore Street on a Friday afternoon in late January. Eleanor had known the approximate arrival time and had still managed to be on the porch before the car reached the curb, wearing her work clothes. Because she had been at the garden and had not had time to change her hands slightly dirty at the knuckles, her hair imperfect. She was aware of this with mild anxiety for approximately the 3 seconds it took for the car to stop and for Caleb to get out. He looked at the house first, the whole of it, the repaired porch, and the new light fixture, and the winter bare yard. And then he looked at her. He ran. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a man crossing a sidewalk at something faster than a walk, because the distance between him and his mother had become briefly intolerable. She came down the steps to meet him, and he hugged her with the full weight of someone who has been holding something in reserve for months and has decided to stop. "You came here," she said into his shoulder. "Where else would I go?" It was not a question. It was the answer to something he had apparently resolved some time ago without needing to announce it. Sarah appeared a moment later, and Emma and Leo having already located the backyard gate and made a judgment about their priorities. The evening that followed was the kind of organized chaos that small houses with children in them produce naturally, and that Eleanor had not experienced in a very long time. Emma was 7 and had opinions about everything and expressed them without editorial filter, which Eleanor found entirely refreshing. Leo was 5 and had decided within 8 minutes of arrival that the backyard oak tree was personally significant to him in ways he could not yet articulate but was working on. Dot arrived with a cake she had apparently been planning for 2 days. Walt appeared with wine and the quiet pleasure of a man who belongs somewhere and knows it. Agnes sent soup via Noah, who stayed for an hour and left with the instinctive social reading of a young person who understands when the occasion belongs to someone else. The kitchen held all of them badly and wonderfully. Eleanor stood at the stove and listened to 4 simultaneous conversations and watched Leo explain the oak tree's significance to Walt, who crouched down to Leo's level with complete seriousness and asked follow-up questions. Later, after the children were asleep and Sarah had gone up exhausted from the flight, Eleanor and Caleb sat on the porch in their coats with cups of tea, the January night cold and still around them. "I was angry at Dad when it happened," Caleb said. "I'm still angry at him. But in the beginning I was also confused about you. I didn't understand what you were doing. The settlement. I thought you were punishing yourself for some reason I couldn't see." She held the cup in both hands and looked at the street. "I know. I understand it now." He turned the cup slowly. "You weren't punishing yourself. You were buying yourself back. That's what you were doing." She was quiet for a moment with the precision of his phrasing. She had thought about her decision in many ways in the months since the courthouse had turned it over and examined it from different angles, and she had never found that particular formulation before, and it was exactly right. "I spent 42 years arranging myself around what that life required," she said. "I didn't notice how much of me I had rearranged until I was standing in an empty house with a brass key and the sudden freedom to be a person whose opinions about her own kitchen mattered." Banton Caleb looked at her sidelong the way he had always looked at her when he was working out whether to say the next thing. He said it. "Dad has a girlfriend. Her name's Kristen. She's 35 and she seems genuinely nice, which I think is worse for him than if she were awful. He won the house and he's bored in it, Mom. He calls me and complains about being bored." She had known about Kristen since the courthouse parking lot and had lived with the knowledge long enough that it had lost its acute edge. "I hope he figures out what he actually needed," she said, and found she meant it without irony. "It took me 69 years and a crisis. Maybe it'll take him less time." "I'm proud of you." He said it simply without elaboration or the hesitation that often precedes sincerity. and it landed with a weight entirely disproportionate to its syllable count. The accumulated significance of having needed to hear it from exactly this person. From inside through the kitchen window, she could see the refinished cabinets in the warm light, the wood finally doing what it had been waiting all those years to do. Frank called on a Thursday. She was in the garden with Agnes planning the spring beds. His name on the screen still produced a slight adjustment in her nervous system, the residue of 42 years of that name meaning something enormous. He sounded different. The architectural confidence reduced to something flatter. And in the flatness she heard what had always been underneath it. The man from the Valentine's card lost somewhere inside the decades of success and its particular distortions. I've been thinking. I made a mistake. With Kristen, with the divorce, with all of it. I miss our life. I miss you. I think we could talk about whether there's a version where... Frank. She said it quietly. She was standing at the edge of the garden with the winter bear beds around her and her notebook open to the spring planting diagrams. I want you to be happy. That's true. I hope you figure out how. She breathed. But what we had is finished. That chapter is done, and I'm not going back to read it again, and I'm not sorry about that. I'm grateful for it, and I'm finished with it. A pause. You gave me the most useful gift anyone has ever given me. You forced me to let go of a life I had been slowly disappearing inside of. So I mean it when I say thank you, and I mean it equally when I say goodbye. She ended the call and stood in the garden for a moment. Agnes appeared beside her and handed her a cup of coffee from the thermos she carried to every garden session, and did not ask any questions. And the two of them stood in the cold and talked about whether the east corner had enough drainage for the tomatoes Agnes had planned there. And that was exactly the right thing. The potluck happened on the third Saturday of February, and by that point the planning had accumulated its own momentum and was no longer entirely in anyone's control, which Eleanor had come to understand was the sign of something real. The backyard had been transformed during the fall and winter in increments. Agnes and Eddie had helped design the raised bed arrangement along the south fence. Walt and Noah had built them from lumber, sourced from a salvage yard. The fire pit was Noah's work, and the string lights had been Eleanor's own addition one Saturday, when she found them at a garage sale and knew immediately where they belonged. 12 mismatched chairs from 5 different sources occupied the space around the fire pit. None of them matched. All of them were exactly right. By 4 in the afternoon, the yard held 31 people. Eddie's chili was on the fire. Ruth had made bread in Eleanor's oven and was explaining the process to Emma, who had decided bread was something she needed to understand. Agnes circulated with the assurance of a woman in her element. Caleb and Sarah worked the table with the ease of people who have found the community they want their children to grow up inside. Walt managed the grill with the focused competence he brought to every physical task, and Leo stood beside him receiving instruction on the correct application of heat with an expression of absolute seriousness. Eleanor moved through the yard talking to people and making the small facilitations that keep a large gathering, feeling easy rather than managed. And at a certain point, she stepped back against the fence and simply looked at all of it. The string lights had come on as the winter sun dropped. She could hear Emma's laugh from the bread table, and the particular timbre of Caleb's voice when he was telling a story, and the low ongoing murmur of 31 people in close proximity, who were glad to be exactly where they were. She was 50 feet away from the woman at the gate before she fully registered the figure standing there. 60, perhaps 62 in a good winter coat that had been purchased for a different life, standing at the entrance to the backyard with the particular stillness of someone who has arrived somewhere and is not sure the arrival was intended. Her face had the composed, slightly braced expression of a person who has learned to manage uncertainty by presenting a surface that does not reveal it. Eleanor knew the expression with the intimacy of someone who had worn it in parking lots and courtrooms and hardware stores for months. Eleanor crossed the yard. "Hi, I'm Eleanor. This is our neighborhood potluck. You're completely welcome." The woman looked at her. "I moved into 43 2 weeks ago. I wasn't sure." She stopped. "I saw the lights." "The lights are the point," Eleanor said. "Come in, I'll introduce you to everyone." She paused and said the thing that Dot had said to her on a different October morning, not as an echo, but as a true thing being passed forward. "You don't have to explain anything. You're just welcome." The woman's face changed, the composed surface relaxing into something more genuine and more uncertain, the expression of someone who has been offered exactly what they needed and is not yet sure they are allowed to accept it. Eleanor recognized this too. She knew precisely how long that feeling lasted and what came after it if you let it. She brought her Carol was her name across the yard and into the gathered warmth, and watched her posture change within 10 minutes in the company of Agnes's direct welcome and Ruth's dry humor, and Eddie's matter-of-fact kindness. Watched her accept a bowl of chili and find herself drawn into a conversation with the naturalness of someone who has been starving for exactly this and did not know what to call the hunger. Walt appeared beside Eleanor some time later, when the fire had settled into coals and the children had been brought inside by Sarah, and the adults had pulled their chairs into a closer arrangement, and the conversation had become the kind that only happens when people are warm and full and genuinely at ease. He stood next to her and looked at the yard for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I've been thinking about how to say something," he said. He had the directness of a man who has lived long enough to know that the elaborate staging of important moments is usually a form of postponement. "I'm 68 years old, and I have learned slowly and at some cost that the time to say a thing is when the thing is true, not when the setting is perfect. The setting is never perfect." He looked at her steadily. "I love you, Ellie. That's the thing." She had known something was coming, had felt the approach of it for weeks, the way you feel weather before it arrives. And still the directness of it landed with the full weight of something unexpected. Because knowing and receiving are different conditions, and she was in both simultaneously. She looked at him. She thought about the cabinets and what it meant to do the patient work on something until it became what it was always capable of being. She thought about the difference between the life she had left and the life she was standing inside of, and the long, strange route between them. "I love you too," she said, not as a completion of his sentence, but as its own sentence, its own decision. The declaration of a woman who has paid enough to know exactly what she means when she says a thing. "I didn't think I had this in me anymore. I thought that particular door was closed, and I had made my peace with that. I was wrong about the door." He reached over and took her hand, and they stood by the fire pit in the February cold, with the string lights above them, and the sound of conversation and warmth around them, and the oak tree visible against the night sky. And she thought about all the ways a life could surprise you, if you let it. If you stopped insisting it follow the route you had already mapped and trusted it instead to know the way. Later, when the yard had mostly emptied, and Caleb had stayed to help with the folding chairs, while Sarah took the children home, Eleanor sat on the porch steps with her coat on and a last cup of tea going cold in her hands. Caleb came out and sat beside her the way he had been sitting beside her on porch steps since he was small enough that she had to be careful not to let him fall. And neither of them said anything for a while. The street was quiet. From down the block she could hear music, faint and sourceless. She thought about the brass key which was now in a small ceramic dish on the kitchen windowsill, no longer carried in her bag, no longer needed as both key and talisman, but simply the key to the house she lived in, ordinary and sufficient. She thought about the courthouse and the parking lot, and the first night on the floor in the sleeping bag, and the casserole warm in her hands, and the column of pencil marks, and all the increments by which an ending becomes a beginning, without ever announcing the transition. Walt had asked her, standing in the light of the fire, no regrets. She had taken the question seriously, had given it the full weight of her honest attention, rather than the reflexive reassurance it could have received. She had thought about all of it, the marriage and its genuine good years, the grief of watching it fail, the humiliation of the courthouse, the fear of the first weeks, the blisters and the cold nights and the water heater, and the 3 a.m. wakefulness when the numbers refused to add up. She had thought about all the things she had lost, and all the things she had found, and whether any accounting of the two categories produced a sum she recognized as regret. Not one, she had said. Sitting on the porch steps in February with Caleb's shoulder against hers, and the lights still strung between the backyard trees, and Carol across the street in number 43 beginning whatever her particular version of this was. Eleanor understood that the truest things she had ever said were not the complex ones, not the ones that required careful architecture and the right conditions, but the simplest ones, the ones that were just accurate. Not one. I love you too. Come in, you're welcome. This is where I chose to be. She had spent 42 years in a house that asked her to be smaller than she was. She had spent 8 months in a house that asked nothing, except that she show up, and she had shown up. And what had come of it was this: the fire pit, the lights, the bread, the children's laughter, the man who had taken her hand, the woman across the street beginning something new, the son beside her who had crossed an ocean because home turned out to be wherever she was. She had let go of a mansion and found that what fell into her hands was not nothing. It was everything that marble floors and catered parties had never been large enough to hold. The night air was cold and clean. She leaned her shoulder into her son's and looked at the sky above Sycamore Street, and felt with the particular fullness of someone who has arrived somewhere after a long, indirect route exactly where she was supposed to be.